often assume that World War I caused women to get the vote because they proved their worth as patriotic citizens. This has really been exaggerated somewhat.
They did prove themselves to be great citizens, but at the same time, that's not what got them the vote. They could have had the vote before the war, and they might have had the vote before the war if the war hadn't happened. So the advocating for their right to vote is one thing, their involvement with the war is another one.
While we might see the war as hastening suffrage in some provinces, it actually has to be seen as very divisive as well. Most women, the majority, supported the war, and some of those people argued they should put aside their suffrage campaigning for the duration of the war.
But just like all women don't speak in one voice, this was the same thing in terms of their interpretation of the war. So there are a number of women that don't support the war.
They were a minority, and we know less about them because, in fact, we believe many of the articles they might have written for newspapers would have been censored at the time. They were international in their perspective. Some of them attended meetings outside the country to meet with other pacifist suffragists and feminists, and they tended to be quite reviled by the pro-war suffragists, who went so far as to call them traitors. But all in all, it became a rather divisive time for suffragists, and that was exacerbated by the 1917 Wartime Election Act, which the federal government introduced to hurry along its support for conscription.
The wartime elections vote gave women the right to vote. If they're active in the war, they have the right to vote. If they're connected to people that are involved in the war, they get the right to vote.
In general, Quebec was very anti-conscription, and suffragists there were completely dismayed that the vote was tied to whether or not you had a son, father, male relative serving overseas. That is who secured the vote in 1917. And in fact, it became divisive across the country, particularly on the prairies, but elsewhere too, because some suffragists actually stood up and said, no, this is discriminatory. Give the vote to all women. Don't give it just to some women because of their ethnic background. But I think we have to see the war not as a high point, but as a time when the suffrage movement was actually very fragile and quite divided, revealing some of the cracks in the coalition for suffrage.